Jewish online magazine. The feature is the golden age of Ilford jewry, and our special guest today is Harold Palmer. Thank you for joining.
No, my pleasure.
Thank you for joining Jewish Online magazine. Can you tell me your first memories of Ilford?
Well, I was born in Ilford, so they are my very first memories. So I was born in King George Hospital in 1956 in Newbury Park. So like a lot of people of my generation, my earliest memories go back to further than most people can go. So generally, when you look at first memories,
so your mum and dad
moved to Ilford in just after the war.
Right.
There was a huge movement after the war. I mean, after the war, there was a huge movement from the East End into Ilford, and specifically parts of Gants Hill, Barkingside. Clay Hill was being developed in the 60s, and obviously parts of it had already.
Why Gants Hill, Ilford? Why did the Jews start coming there from North London?
Well, it wasn't so much North London. I mean, a lot came from East London as well. But they were following the Central Line out. I mean, what basically happened was, as the suburbs were developing, people followed the Central Line out into Gants Hill. If you look at Newbury Park Station, for example, it's one of the finest pieces of Art Deco architecture you'll ever see. And the outside of Newbury Park Station is listed. And it's a fabulous piece, and it's typical of the 1930s type of architecture. And people followed the line out. I remember my grandmother thinking that when my mother was going to Gants Hill, that she was moving somewhere to the countryside. I mean, that's how they viewed Essex. Essex didn't have the kind of name it's got now. It was considered something rural and undeveloped. But this was part of a huge extended network of family and friends that moved from areas like Hessel Street, areas off the Commercial Road, which was very much East End of London, Whitechapel, places like that, into London. But they were a unique set of individuals.
From what period were the Jews from the East End settling into?
Basically after the war.
Right, okay.
And they were buying properties there after the war. But the boom age, if you like, I've always said, was the 60s, because that's when the children were born, and that's when the most facilities.
What was the Jewish population then, perhaps when you were born?
It was
in Ilford.
I have no idea what the actual numbers were, but it was by the 60s it had become the largest centre of Jews in Europe.
That's amazing statistics.
Absolutely, it's incredible to think of now, because I lived in Beehive Lane, which is very much the centre of it. And Beehive Lane Shore, if you look at it, for the huge numbers of people that were there were relatively few Shomer Shabbos from people.
Why is that?
Take somebody who was very famous who was Shomer Shabbos, like Johnny Simons. Johnny Simons was the father-in-law of Lord Sugar. And I grew up with Johnny Simons, and I used to see him go to shul every week carrying his tallis bag, and he used to pass the flats where we lived on his way to the shul. And we were very good friends. My mother particularly was very good friends with his wife, who unfortunately died quite young. He was very untypical, because he was Shomer Shabbos, he was a frum guy. He had the grandfather living with him, Mr. Schneider, who was a tailor. And it was very unusual, because the war, I think, took a lot of people's frumkeit away.
Yes.
But
understandable then, no?
Absolutely, but don't believe also that these people were terribly from. This isn't Stamford Hill. These people who are my family and my friends and my whole world weren't necessarily from the beginning. They weren't necessarily from after the war. In 1948 to 1950s, they weren't terribly from then, and this movement came into Ilford. They weren't reform. I mean, I don't remember the reform until the 1960s in Newbury Park. I mean, before then it was an unheard of thing for me, but I first heard about it then. And they were all members of Orthodox shuls. I mean, the Federation in Coventry Road, which was Old Ilford, had an enormous membership. But
Were there many kosher butcher shops?
there was at least 15. That I
Wow,
can remember.
15 kosher butcher shops.
That I can remember. But there was kosher grocery shops, there was kosher butcher shops. The facilities were there because lots of people kept kosher.
Right.
But that's always been the way. I mean, that's
And what about schooling?
You see, when I was at my first school, my first school was very much a kind of posh English school. But by the time I went to my second school, at least half the class were Jewish. The non-Jewish school, when I went to the secondary school, half the class were Jewish. Again, it was a non-Jewish school, but half the class were Jewish, and that's the way it was. I mean, there was relatively little anti-Semitism from that perspective, because we had the numbers. You know, it was that wasn't necessarily a problem for us.
And then, why do you think the concept was created to have a Jewish primary school in the area?
It was long overdue. When I met the chief rabbi for the first time when I was a councillor, this was Lord Jacobowitz in Rocha. We were talking about schools then. To be honest with you, this was long overdue, and we didn't actually have a Jewish school in Ilford.
There was a need for it, was there?
There was the Cladden Jewish Day School moved to Ilford, and that was in the 1960s again, I believe. But to be honest with you, there was a desperate need for it. There was no Jewish education there. There was a yeshiva just off Clarence Avenue, run by people like Rabbi G. Lubavitch had a small presence over the glaziers in Beehive Lane, which was like a very small room. You would occasionally see from boys in Valentine's Park playing football with their kippahs on their, fixed to their heads with hair clips in the 60s. This was rare, and they were generally visitors from places like Hackney, from Stamford Hill, from Stoke Newington, people who are coming into the area. So in terms of the Fromkeit, in terms of education, there was nothing, although there was Cheder. Everybody went to Cheder. You had Tuesday and Thursday nights after school and Sunday mornings. Cheders were very, very big.
Was it well attended, the Cheders?
Very, very well attended. I mean, people went there, boys and girls, not just to learn their bar mitzvahs. Don't forget the concept of a bat mitzvah was unheard of.
Was this because most Jewish children attended non-Jewish schools and their parents wanted them to have some kind of Jewish education?
Wanted them to learn the Aleph base,
right.
Wanted them to be able to do a bar mitzvah properly.
Right.
Because this was part of the thing, you had to be able to do your bar mitzvah. Doesn't matter how you learnt it.
Yes.
But you had to be, even if it was by heart, you had to do it. And there was a flourishing business in people coming in and teaching boys their bar mitzvah as well as the Kedorim. From day one. So I mean,
what about restaurants?
Well, restaurants weren't a big issue for us. The Sharon came along in the late 60s, and it was a very big restaurant, and it was the centre of Gants Hill, if you like, social life for a long time. I was actually a councillor. It was closed down, and I was one of the people consulted when it closed down, unfortunately. Well, that's another story entirely.
Yes.
But kosher restaurants, there weren't many. You would find, unfortunately, at the time, to be honest with you.
But with many thousands of Jews.
I must tell you, you would find the Wimpy, which was a non-kosher beef burger bar, absolutely packed with Jewish kids. That, unfortunately, is a fact of life, of 60s life in Ilford.
But that was circumstances, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't...
It was new, that's the way people were then. Yes, it was circumstances, we didn't have the facilities.
But also, it was, I think it was the circumstances of perhaps the war years and
yes.
Holocaust survivors.
No, see, that's the whole point. The generation that came into Ilford were not Holocaust survivors as such. These are people who came to the East End in the 1870s and 1880s. And I'll give you an interesting fact about that you might want to consider. If you spoke with a non-English accent, i.e. you were a refugee or you came from the camps, you stood out a mile. I can think of Reverend Skalatsky, the Dr. Wallach, who was a popular doctor in Beehive Lane, Mrs. Fishman, who was a very popular social figure. There were perhaps half a dozen people I knew out of the thousands that spoke with any kind of accent. These people came to England to escape the Tsars from Russia and the minor ones from Poland in Victorian times.
Yes,
and they came from the East End into Ilford and Ganshill. So they're very much more English, rather than the generation that came into, say, Golders Green from the whole of Europe after the war. It was a totally different group of people with different ideas, and obviously the people who came after were much more from.
Okay. This draws the end of part 1, and we'll be joining Howard Palmer with more of his thoughts and opinions on the golden age of Ilford jewry in part 2. See you soon.